So, what I want to talk about today is not all theory, right? Those already exist. They explain stage three in a way that a paper or series is supposed to. You know, the development model laid out, the evidence gathered, the argument built, hold weight under scrutiny. Today, this something else, and I wanted to be honest with you about the difference before you hear it, because I think the difference is the whole point. So what follows is testimony, no explanation. I'm going to talk about stage three because that's what we're dealing with, both on the outside and intentional residue. But I'm not going to define stage three for you. If you finish this recording without a clean clinical picture of what it means, is not a failure of what I'm doing here. It's what I'm doing here, doing what I set out to do. Hopefully that made sense. The definition of stage three. I lived through the thing itself, the whole of it, one word at a time for decades, whilst everyone around me assumed affluent life meant affluent interior underneath it. So I wrote this script the way I've come to write the things that actually cost me something, not by explaining from the outside, but by staying inside the experience long enough for the complete gestalt, the whole of it, to find its own shape. So I came out, as it tends to do, closer to poetry than prose, and I've let it stay there. So some of what happened to me only survives intact in that register. So take this for what it is. It's not a lecture. It's not a case study. It's a record of a life that developmental language never quite knew how to recognize. Told from the only place I could ever actually tell it from, which is the inside. So, living at stage three. I reached stage three somewhere around primary school. I stayed. A sentence sounds smaller than the life it contains. A developmental stage, a place on a chart with arrows politely pointing onward toward the grammar everyone assumes must come next. I reached stage three. I stayed there until my mid-30s. Fuck. Not for a season. Not through one difficult year while some hidden machinery quietly catches up. Decades. Long enough for the children beside me to become adults. Long enough for schools to finish with me. For adolescence to arrive with all its teeth. For countries to pass beneath airplane wings. For work to harden into expertise. For expertise to become a career. For people to bring me questions with consequences and wait for my answer. Long enough to raise children. All of that happened at stage three. People hear stage three and imagine a toddler, a small body on a clinic floor, a laminated card, a therapist kneeling with the professional, hopeful face adults wear when they're waiting for language to perform the next approved trick. People hear stage three and imagine a place where a child is meant to pass through. I hear stage three and remember school. I remember corridors. I remember being gentle in a world that regarded gentleness as either sweetness or evidence. I remember the strange, low electrical weather of other children, the alliances, the rankings, the casual little governments forming and dissolving between one bell and the next. Reading and arithmetic were the cover story. The real curriculum was status. Who could speak without consequence? Who could wound without appearing to have done anything at all? Who knew when a joke was not a joke? Who understood that the sentence itself was often less important than who was permitted to say it? I did not have the scripts for that. I had language. Let us correct that immediately. I had language, the way a house may have electricity during a storm. Present, essential, flickering, maybe available under conditions nobody around me could see. I had scripts some good ones, some beautiful ones, some inherited whole from moments that held long enough to become repeatable. But they belong to another ecology, having grown for warmth, for familiarity, for known rhythms, for exchanges whose walls stayed or had last found them. Then they were sent into childhood without a code. No script for teasing, no script for the sentence that means one thing until everyone laughs in it and then it means another. No script for humiliation delivered casually at speed with witnesses. No script for the moment when an answer is required before I found the place inside me from which an answer could be carried. The language not absent, it was to the room. That's different. And the room was rarely willing to wait. I reached stage 3 and stayed. To understand what that means, you have to abandon the little cinematic version in which thought begins as a sentence somewhere backstage and then walks neatly forward into the mouth. That is never how it happened. There was no sentence waiting in the wings, no orderly queue of words holding numbered tickets, no small internal clerk stamping syntax and waving each phrase toward departure. There was the whole of it. Then there was pressure. And then sometimes, one dependable word. I would find it, not the first word of a sentence I already knew, the only place large enough to stand. I would offer it. Then stop. Not because the thought had ended, because the world had changed. Your face moved. Your mouth prepared its answer. Your attention sharpened or loosened. The word entered you, and something became. I could no longer control it. So I watched. I listened. I waited to discover what I had said. That is not a clever paradox. That was my life. I knew what I meant before language, but I did not know what the word meant between us until I saw what it did to you. If it landed near enough, another word became probable, not inevitable, possible. That was the architecture. One word, a face, a correction, another word, a narrowing bridge assembled beneath my feet only after I'd already stepped forward. Most people speak as though the sentence belongs to them. I spoke as though the sentence belonged to the field and might revoke its permission at any moment. Every response recalculated the world. Every flicker changed the available route. Conversation was not a path I travelled. It was terrain formed under pressure. Live, relational, unforgiving, no map, no net, no guarantee that the place I had just placed my weight would still exist when I needed the next step. And underneath it, always, a particular fear, not anxiety in the abstract, not some free-floating clinical mist waiting to be measured on a scale from never to nearly every day. The fear was precise. The sentence was always just beginning to fail, quietly, not with an alarm, not with a theatrical collapse of words scattering across the floor. The failure began the way foundations move before the crack appears. The room still looked intact. You still believed we were speaking about the same thing. I knew we were no longer standing in the same place. That was a terror. No silence, misalignment. The possibility that you would keep moving through a conversation I had already lost. Taking my nodding body as evidence that I remain. Now, imagine. No. You do not need to imagine. This is not an exercise. I'm telling you what happened. Every classroom, every parent-teacher meeting, every doctor asking a question whose answer matters, every interview I somehow passed, every telephone call allowed to ring twice before I picked up. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because 2 rings was sometimes enough time to locate the first word. 2 rings. That was the accommodation. Unofficial, unrecorded, free to the institution, paid for entirely by my body. Every time someone leaned toward me for warmth and curiosity and asked, "So, what do you think?" Before the question had finished arriving, my body was already calculating whether I could survive the answer. I reached stage 3, and I stayed. There was an outside version of me, of course there was. The world is very fond of outside versions. They're easier to diagnose, easier to praise, easier to punish. Outside, quiet, calm, reserved, measured. Intelligent, people said, in the tone that makes intelligence sound less like recognition than a small warning issued from the room. Distant, aloof, cold, someone decided, though coldness is often just a name other people give to warmth they can access on demand. Odd, brilliant, sometimes. That one was dangerous. Brilliance is a trap when it becomes evidence that nothing underneath it could possibly require support. Inside, scanning, predicting, testing, correcting, holding, rebuilding the shared world before anyone noticed it had broken. Relief when a word remained where I had placed it. Fear before I knew whether it would. People call it flat affect. They say this as though they have found the absence, as though the face were an empty screen, as though emotion failing to arrive in the approved visible format must not have occurred. I spent years wondering what they were actually watching. Perhaps flat affect is sometimes the outside of a person whose inside has nowhere safe to appear, or more precisely, whose inside has already been assigned other work. I was not emotionally absent. I was emotionally occupied. Every part of me that might have softened the voice, animated the face, made feeling legible to a person who believed legibility and existence were the same thing. Every part was already working, full capacity, holding the conversation together, watching for fracture, keeping my body still so that stillness removed one more unstable variable from the exchange already close to collapse. The feeling was there. The feeling was sometimes the largest thing in the room. But the face was needed for watching. The voice was needed for calibration. The body was needed as scaffolding. Flat affect was not the absence of an interior. It was the visible cost of keeping the interior connected to everything else. That difference matters. No, it matters, but even that phrase has become too clean. What's the difference between being understood as overwhelmed and being understood as empty? Between being given time and being given correction? Between being seen as a person who's working beyond capacity and being treated as someone who didn't care? The outside words they never described who I was. They described what survival looked like from where other people were standing. Quiet, reserved, aloof, brilliant, odd. Every adjective a little forensic photograph of the compensation. Every label an account of the smoke that carefully avoided mentioning the fire. Underneath it, shame. I don't say that for effect. Shame is not the dramatic part. Shame is administrative. It files everything under personal failure. The delayed answer, the missed joke, the phone call not returned, the conversation rehearsed for days and still abandoned before it began. The simple question that opened an entire weather system inside the body. Everyone else appeared to move through language the way people move through a house they have inhabited for years, without checking whether the hallway still leads where it led yesterday, without testing the chair before sitting, without pausing at the threshold to calculate whether that room will permit it to remain. So I assumed certainty must be easy for everyone else. I assumed they spoke from a stable floor. I assumed their fluency was proof of a kind of moral readiness I had failed to acquire. I became ashamed of hesitation, ashamed of silence, ashamed of needing one more second, then another, ashamed of the blankness. That was not blankness, but congestion, too much arriving through a route narrow enough to carry it. Eventually, and this is the part that still catches, I became ashamed of needing language at all, as though the requirement to translate oneself were a character flaw. So the person should be able to cross the distance without a bridge, as though dependence on words were weakness rather than the ordinary human arrangement made visible only because mind did not survive on schedule. I reached stage 3. I stayed. Nobody saw it. It's not an accusation. Let us not build a villain simply because systems prefer stories with a face they can blame. Yeah. Compensations worked. That's the whole answer. And it's quieter than anyone wants. My vocabulary grew, my knowledge grew, my career grew. My life from the outside became visibly adult. I traveled, I worked. I became someone whose technical judgment other adults trusted. I stood before rooms. I explained complex things. I answered questions. I raised children. Became evidence against my own experience. That is the cruelty. The outcome concealed the process. Success arrived wearing the clothes of fluency, and everyone reasonably mistook one for the other. If she can do this, the reading went, then language must already be there. Never said unkindly, never spat across the desk with a written out of breath, embedded in every expectation. If the life became larger, language must have enlarged first, made the life possible. It had not. The life became larger because I kept building it through apertures too small to reveal what they cost. This is one of the cruelest properties of compensation. When it works, it destroys its own evidence. The better I crossed the distance, the less credible the distance became. The more successfully I translated, the more translation disappeared. Competence became a solvent. It dissolved the labor that produced it. And then the world looked at what remained and called me gifted. Fuck. I reached stage 3 and a state. The exhaustion wasn't social exhaustion, not merely. Not the familiar introvert story in which a quiet evening, a closed door, a cup of tea, and one pleasantly weighted blanket restored the system by morning. No. Exhaustion was computational, except that word makes it sound clean, mechanical. A processor overheating in a white laboratory whilst technicians take notes. It was not clean. It was existential. My actual right to remain inside of a conversation depended on not losing the thread. Lose it, and I was not simply embarrassed. People imagine forgetting a word. That's not it. It was watching my own participation quietly end whilst my body remained in the room. The conversation continued. My chair was still occupied. My face still arranged itself in the appropriate attention. My body nodded at intervals, learned through repetition, but I was no longer living where everyone else was living. I had fallen out of the shared world without moving. There are no words for how lonely that is. No. There are words now. There were no words available then. That's different. The others carried on because nothing visible had happened. No alarm, no collapse, no socially useful emergency. Only the person quietly ceasing to be able to inhabit the exchange. Still present, still accountable, still expected to answer when her turn returned. This is the kind of disappearance institutions prefer. It doesn't mean interrupting the meeting. It does not delay the lesson. It does not require paperwork. The person vanishes. The chair stays useful. And then grief. Always grief. No grand grief, no orchestral. Something smaller, more durable kind. How many conversations never happened? How many friendships died before they acquired enough language to be recognized as possible? How many questions I carried on because I couldn't build them before the moment closed? How many rooms I left with entire lives still untranslated inside of me? How many versions of myself never became available to anyone else? Not because they were imaginary, and not because they were immature, and not because the self had failed to form, because they couldn't survive the crossing long enough to become sentences. There's so much inside of me. That's the correction. Not too little, too much, too whole, too relational, too dependent on a world that would not remain still long enough for language to take its measurement. One word at a time was not evidence of a narrow interior. It was all I could safely carry through the opening. I reached stage 3. I stayed. Then something changed. Not intelligence. Let us remove that fantasy before it starts. I had intelligence and abundance, which is partly how the difficulty learned to hide. Not effort. Gods know I had effort. I built whole years from effort and no motivation. That old clinical accusation dressed up as explanation. I wanted language. I wanted contact. I wanted to remain when people spoke to me. I wanted to ask the questions that arrived complete and died at the mouth. I wanted. That was the never missing part. What changed was a person. And this sounds sentimental. It's not. Not a savior, not a therapist, not an intervention. Not someone with a clipboard and a measurable objective for the quarter. Not someone breaking language into approved increments and handing it back as though we had invented the parts. Person who liked talking to me. That was all. That was everything. Hour after hour, year after year, no extraction, no evaluation, no pressure beneath kindness. No sense that the conversation was a corridor leading toward performance. She was not waiting for the correct version of me to arrive. Nobody had ever wanted to stay with me inside unfinished language before. Stay. There's that word again. I stayed at stage 3. And then someone stayed with me. Not above me, not ahead of me, not calling me from the next developmental stage with instructions on how to catch up. Alongside. Inside the pauses. Inside the half-built sentence. Inside the long stretch where meaning was present but had not yet found a structure that could hold between two people. For the first time in my life, language was not an examination. It was not a narrow bridge with an assessor waiting on the other side. It was not evidence. It was not performance. It was not the price of remaining human in the room. Language became somewhere I could live. That did not happen because grammar improved. Grammar improved because I happened. The field changed before the language did. Safety changed. Time changed. The pause stopped meaning failure. The unfinished sentence stopped forecasting abandonment. What could be wrong without the whole self becoming wrong inside it? And a thought could take the longer route. A correction could remain inside intimacy instead of becoming evidence for dismissal. I was given permission. No, permission's still too hierarchical. Nobody granted me a license. The conditions changed until permission was no longer required. Language was held alongside me instead of tested inside. Only then could grammar begin to keep its shape. Not because someone had taught me the next stage. I was not instructed into complexity. I was befriended into the conditions where complexity could remain. That distinction is the whole talk. It's not a talk, it's a record of a life. Developmental language did not know how to recognize. I reached stage 3, a state. And stage 3 carried me I need to say that because survival structures are so often insulted the moment we no longer need them in quite the same way. People look back and call them primitive, maladaptive, delayed, a deficit to be overcome so that the cleaner self may emerge normal. Stage 3 carried me, one dependable word at a time, carried me through childhood, through school, through adolescence, badly, but through. It carried me across countries, contexts, into work, into rooms where people assumed the woman speaking had always possessed the sentences she gave them. It carried me into a career I still kind of quite believe I built. It carried me through parenthood, through emergencies, through forms and doctors and interviews, through every telephone ring I borrowed as time. It kept me alive, faithfully, long enough for the conditions around me to change. My stage 3 was not empty. It was not primitive. It was not a waiting room where the real person sat unfinished until grandma called her name. Stage 3 was faithful. It held what it could hold. It moved what it could move. It preserved the relation when language can yet carry the architecture of the whole. People think not having sentences means not having thoughts. My experience was closer to the opposite. There was so much life inside of me that one word at a time was all I could safely bring through. The person did not appear when the sentence did. Let us not get silly about it. She had already crossed oceans. She already loved. She had already been wounded by things she can answer. She had already stood before rooms and carried consequence. She had already raised children. She had already built an entire adult life inside a form of language the developmental charts had reserved for toddlers. The sentences did not make her larger. They did not make her real. They did not summon a hidden person from some pre-linguistic dark and teach her how to become human. She'd been there all along, whole, not inaccessible to herself, not absent, not waiting, living, carrying more than the opening could bear. The sentences became larger, that's all. No, not all. The sentences became large enough for more of her to cross without being taken into something smaller. Large enough to hold relations without collapsing them. Large enough to carry history, correction, contradiction, desire. Large enough for the words not to stand alone and tremble under the burden of the whole. Large enough for uncertainty to remain uncertainty without becoming shame. Large enough for a thought to survive another person's face. Large enough for me to stay. I reached stage 3 somewhere around primary school. I stayed there until my mid-30s. That still sounds in my own mouth like a clerical error, an impossible entry in a developmental record, a number misfiled by decades, a woman living an adult life in the place professionals have named for children. But perhaps the error was never mine. Perhaps the chart mistook sequence for time. Perhaps it saw what language looked like when it emerged and confused appearance with origin. Perhaps it measured the opening and concluded that it measures the life beyond it, behind it. Perhaps stage 3 was never small. Perhaps the word was simply the largest place I could reliably live with you. One word, then another, then, after decades, a sentence, not polished, not effortless, not proof that the earlier life had been empty, just larger. Large enough to carry the woman who had already made it this far. I reached stage 3. I stayed. Then someone stayed with me. And somewhere inside that staying, language stopped being a narrow place where I proved I deserved to remain. It became a home that could change shape without throwing me out. The person did not arrive when the sentences did. She had been there all along. The sentences simply became large enough to carry her, and then large enough for her to remain. So yes, that's a bit much, I realize, and I'm a bit emotional as I kind of read my own writings and stuff, but I wanted to kind of put myself back in these two series as they play out, reaching into the dharma of things. What is this stage upholding? What was stage 3 upholding for me? What was it allowing me to do? Why was I there so long? Questions I have about myself. No therapist can answer these things. And then over on sensual residue, from 3 to 4, and the kind of the long road going there. And as always the case, these things are triggered by questions people ask me, things that happen in life, and so on. And I kind of realized that I'd never really explored that myself. I just kind of did it. I emerged out the outside of that and just kind of put it behind me. But it made sense to come back into to the middle of this conversation that I've put on both. And I put it on both for a reason. They're kind of talking to each other. One is a bit more bodily, inhabited. The other one's more theoretical and philosophical, dharma, that which upholds. But I wanted to come back and kind of put a voice to it, into it, and just spend a wee bit of time contextualizing this. I think sometimes parents, when is Susie going to get to the next step and so on? And leave you with this question. What if it takes 30 years? What then? Thanks.